Sit back and listen to this extremely interesting story. I have read and heard many stories of confusion where a guy mistakenly spends time with another woman thinking she is his wife. While it was interesting at times, I always found the stories silly. It's funny to me when someone tells me a story like that and they really expect me to believe it. Without telling them to their face that they are liars, I often ask questions that seem trivial but tend to expose their fabrications. So this woman had the same figure as your wife. I had never heard of it before. Most women have at least something different about their bodies, birthmarks, distinguishing features, etc., that make them easily distinguishable, is one typical question I suggest. After stuttering a little, the guy who tells the huge one usually says something like, "Well, I was drunk, so I didn't notice the difference at the time." And yet he was supposedly sober enough to have an interest. I especially like asking questions about what happened next. So after you realized the mistake, both you and the woman you thought was your wife agreed never to tell anyone about it, and you ended up skating. "Yes, that's right," was the usual smiling reply as the boy raised his head proudly. "But you're telling me," I would continue with a fake perplexed look on my face. "Ah, geez, well, I know you won't tell anyone," is the typical reply, and then the conversation is terminated, or he changes the subject to something like, "How about them Steelers?" I, Beck Randolph, am married to Mitzi Randolph, née Alton, and have been for 10 years at the time of this story. We were both 34 and had 2 children, ages 5 and 7. Mitzi's body is not particularly noteworthy, although I find her attractive. Her figure is a bit out of proportion, but since I like those, I see that as a positive rather than a negative. Although she's cute to me and I've always found her attractive, she's not someone that the average guy would let his attention be drawn to. She usually wears her brunette hair short, but every once in a while she'll feel extra adventurous and grow her hair out and add brown braids over her blue eyes, which usually changes her look dramatically. We were in need of some time away from work and the kids who we love raising, but they were challenging and we needed a break, and since both sets of grandparents are within a 20-minute drive from our house, we decided to take a 3-day weekend without kids. The grandparents were willing to help, each set to spend 2 days at our house with the kids, which included an overlap of about 12 hours. The overlap was no problem since my parents got along with Mitzi's very well, and they didn't compete for their grandkids' attention. On the internet, Mitzi found a theme weekend at a mountain lodge. It wasn't really a resort, but rather a very large house that the organizer of the theme weekend rented out, along with a chef, a maid, and 3 college-aged guys who worked as bellmen and servers. Theme was 1960s rock bands. Females had to dress like someone from the Pleasure Seekers, the Ronettes, the Ace of Cups, or Goldie and the Gingerbreads. Guys had to dress like someone from the Beach Boys, the Byrds, Blood, Sweat and Tears, or Jefferson Airplane, or a woman could be Gracie Slick. People were encouraged to bring instruments, and a set of drums and a sound system would be provided. The weekend wasn't restricted to the guests acting like old-time rock bands. However, there was also a swimming pool, horseback riding, skeet shooting, dance lessons, and other many activities. Apparently, the dress-up aspect was just to get people in a good mood. Mitzi dressed as Eileen Beidlingmeyer from the Pleasure Seekers, and I dressed as Mike Love from the Beach Boys. Mitzi looked great as Eileen. I wanted to be with her to make her in the Carlo. When we got to the lodge, there was already a happy group of about 20 people, all in costume. Mike Love was about the most normal-looking of the people in the male rock bands involved, but most of the guys had long wigs and mustaches and outrageous clothes. I carried a small surfboard as part of my costume. I was really proud of Mitzi. Although I knew nothing about the Pleasure Seekers before this trip, I found out that they were all hot, wore distinctive short dresses and fake eyelashes when performing, and with her lashes, hair extensions, contacts, and skin-tight short dress, she carried Eileen off very well. By the time that it was about 11 p.m. on Friday night, all 30 weekenders were there, and it was a fun group, various people taking turns on the drums, some dong karaoke with sound tracks playing of the groups that they were supposedly in, others mingling and drinking, and in general making merry. The partying went well into early Saturday morning. Mitzi had had a particularly hard day getting ready for the trip, so she turned in about 1 a.m. I had been drinking more than since college, but wasn't close to drunk. However, I was getting turned on by a number of the female rock artists, most of whom looked really good. They probably ranged in age from 25 to 50, but not a dog among them. Finally, about 3 a.m., things started to wind down and everyone was heading off to their room. A Paul Cantor Jefferson Airplane look. alike, and a Steve Cat's blood, sweat, and tears wannabe were both drunk and passed out. Many others were moving slowly. Foolishly, in my opinion, instead of numbering the rooms, as would be sensible, they were all named after mountains. The owner of the lodge must not have been a very nice guy, because most of the mountains were used as room names that I had never heard of. They were not simple or famous like Everest or Denali. I swear, Mitzi told us our room was something like Mini Peak, which of course I'd never heard of, but seemed easy to remember. Since the bells carried our bags straight to our rooms, neither Mitzi nor I were there until it was time for bed. I walked around the entire second floor without finding the name. Fortunately, the second room I came to on the third floor was Macra Peak, which made me think that I had just misheard her. I peeked in the room and saw her distinctive pleasures seeker's short dress hanging up. I closed the door and tiptoed into the room. I needed a shower and shampoo, and in the shower stall was a bottle of Herbal Essence's Rose Hips shampoo, one of Mitzi's favorites, which I assumed that she had brought from home. I quickly took a shower and shampoo and went to bed without clothes. It didn't surprise me that Mitzi was also without him, since even though she usually slept in a long t-shirt, she promised me that we were going to have some big league fun without the kids. Mitzi had her back turned to me in an opaque room. I snuggled up to her, and she responded, seemingly unconsciously, by turning to face me. She smelled very good, including the smell of rosehip shampoo in her hair. I was a little confused by her shoulder-length hair until I remembered the hair extensions she put in yesterday to look more like Eileen. Mitzi must have been excited because she seemed to keep snuggling up to me, and I was responding. Even though I drank more than usual, it didn't affect my excitement, and soon I was ready to chat. I kissed Mitzi's shoulder, rubbed her upper arm as she lay on her left side. Mitzi and I hadn't spent time together lying in this position in a long time. I couldn't remember when, though I knew the last time was before our 5-year-old was born, but I remembered how wonderful it felt. This time brought back great old memories. After teasing her a bit, I was as lively as I could remember. I worked furiously, encouraged by her muffled moans, until I heard her pleasure. I grunted like a pig when I was satisfied myself. I didn't leave right away, and unlike my normal day, I didn't stop right away. I stayed with her for a few more minutes as we both made sweet sounds of pleasure. After a very long time, I finally got weak and stopped. As I bent over and kissed her on the neck and rubbed her arms, my life flashed before my eyes when a high-pitched voice said, "Oh, Alan, that was so awesome, darling. After a rest, will you do me concubine? My name isn't Alan, it's Beck, and Mitzi has a raspy voice, not a high-pitched one." Suddenly, all those times I scoffed at stories of mistakenly spending time with the wrong wife, thinking it was her, came flooding back to my mind. What just happened seemed to revolve endlessly in my mind. I couldn't let the woman I was just with know it wasn't Alan. I continued to stroke her, eventually placing my hand over her, trying to trick myself that it was just to get her to turn away from me. In reality, however, stroking and lightly pinching her was very intriguing. Although her figure was not much different from Mitzi, after I kissed the mystery woman some more and played with her, she began to return to her previous position. "Time to work on your concubine." She laughed sleepily, then rolled onto her stomach. I was lucky I knew the position of a concubine from reading stories online, because Mitzi and I had never interacted like that. I'm often a one-and-done guy, but considering how exciting it was to massage her, and how good it felt to have her snuggled up to me, surprisingly, I was back to full strength within seconds. This time when I started working, I realized that she was also very excited and also had differences with Mitzi, and why I did not recognize her immediately. I did not read a good answer. I would never intentionally betray Mitzi, but I persuaded myself that I must come forward again to make sure I was not exposed, for I was sure she would accuse me of coercion if she found out. So I accepted it and worked with more vigor than I could remember, which resulted in exhausting pleasures for both of us. I was still only semi-conscious when I finally stopped being with this girl. I lay down next to her and gently rubbed her until I heard her start snoring. That was my cue to get out of there. I dressed quickly, opened the door only enough to slither out, and then started looking for Mona Peak, wondering why the owner would be fucking stupid enough to name one room Mona Peak and another with the highly similar name Marker Peak. As I was starting down the hallway, however, I heard someone clumping up the stairs. I hid in a janitor's closet and peeked out. There was the drunk Paul Cantor wannabe stumbling, looking carefully at the room names. When he saw Macra Peak, he entered, none too quietly. I hoped that it wasn't loud enough to wake up the mystery woman, obviously the Cantor wannabe's wife. Once the door to Marca Peak closed, I continued down the hall looking at room names. Mona Peak was the last one on the north side of the hall. When I entered, there was Mitzi's slinky dress hanging up, but I wasn't going to be fooled by just it. I looked around some more and found my distinctive suitcase off in a corner. I took another shower with the same herbal essence Rose Hips shampoo in the shower stall than in Marca Peak. I found out later that it was in all of the shower stalls at the lodge. I snuck into bed again naked, finding Mitzi also in the bath. I'd never experienced 3 pleasures in 2 hours before, but I was so pumped up from my sessions with the mystery woman that my excitement grew after snuggling up to Mitzi for just a couple of minutes. Then, as during my foray to the top of Macra, I soon spent as much time with her in the same position as I was worth, as she was a series of appreciative wheezes, not the chirps of the mysterious woman who was to give her away. After an extremely satisfying pleasure, which Mitzi also appreciated, I fell into a deep sleep. Mitzi was in a great mood the next morning. She talked about how much she loved spending time with me in the middle of the night, something we hadn't done in a long time. My mood was more soothing, although I pretended to be as cheerful as Mitzi. I didn't know exactly what I felt or how I was supposed to feel last night. When breakfast was over and everyone was busy with other things, I decided to just enjoy the feeling of euphoria from the phenomenal interactions with the mysterious woman and free myself from any guilt. After breakfast, I tried to find out who the mysterious woman was, since people weren't in costume. During the day, everyone changed again that evening. I wasn't sure who the Paul Cantor contender was. The wife of the guy who looked the most like him was at least 5 inches taller than Mitzi with an even bigger frame, and probably the best woman in the lodge. I couldn't believe she was the one I mistook for Mitzi. We had a great day outdoors, playing bridge with another couple, swimming, playing croquet, and lots of other things. When we redressed for dinner in our rocker costumes, I finally got confirmation of who the mystery woman I had fucked was. She was imitating Arlene Quattro of the Pleasure Seekers, wearing the dress that I had seen hanging up in Marca Peak. It was a different color than Mitzi's dress, and had a few other subtle differences, too subtle for a clueless guy like me. Plus the color difference wasn't enough to have been noticed in a dark room. The Arlene Quattro look-alike was the woman who was at least 5 inches taller than Mitzi and the best-looking woman at the resort. Her name is Alice Thompson, and her Paul Cantor wannabe husband's name is Alan Thompson. He was 30 years old, she was 26. Since both Alice and Mitzi were dressed as pleasure seekers, Mitzi and I sat next to Alan and Alice at dinner and had fun with them afterward. Mitzi and Alice seemed to really hit it off. I was embarrassed by my reaction to Alice. There was again a lot of drinking that evening after dinner. I tried to stay away from Alice for fear of being caught looking at her, and I didn't want to be caught with my excitement on the outside. One day, after many of the guests were stuck, I walked over to where Mitzi, Alice, and the 2 contenders for Goldie and the gingerbread were having an intense, if frivolous, discussion. I managed to sneak close enough to them to eavesdrop. I actually regretted not eavesdropping. Although something flattering was said, it was also scary to the point of horror. Although I cannot remember the exact words, I will never forget the gist of them. Alan gave me the best communication I can remember last night, and then completely insulted me by not remembering them the next morning. I know he was drunk, but my God, how could a guy not remember that, especially since I'm now off my birth control and in the prime of my cycle. We were planning on having babies this weekend, and he doesn't even remember how he did it. Although Alice's words scared the crap out of me, they had another strange effect. Inspired by Alice on Saturday and Sunday nights, I was with Mitzi when we first went to bed, and then again in the middle of the night, both times in the middle of the night in the same position that we both now liked very much and were sure would be in the future. Become a regular part of our married life. There were smiles all around as everyone left on Monday morning. Everyone had a great time. I was most pleased, and Mitzi was literally beaming, but at the same time I was scared. It didn't help that when Alice gave me a goodbye hug, I got excited so quickly that it was a miracle I didn't tear my clothes. I started to sweat as she obviously noticed my excitement and got a really weird look on her face, but luckily Mitzi stepped in with a big hug, and I shook Alan's hand and then got the hell out of there. That weekend turned out to be the best weekend of my married life with Mitzi. We were much more adventurous after the weekend at the lodge, much more energetic, and spent time together much more often. Sometimes I felt a little guilty when I was in that position with Mitzi, because my mind wandered to thoughts of seeing Alice, but I could navigate them without too much guilt. One thing much more negative than positive lingered on after the weekend at the lodge. Mitzi and I became Facebook friends with Alice and Alan, and followed her pregnancy and delivery. I was very concerned when she delivered her little boy Colin, almost exactly 9 months after the lodge weekend. As I continued to follow Alice, Alan, and their little boy Colin, who was joined by a little brother Mason 2 years later, I became more and more concerned. At age 4, Colin looked like I did at that age. At age 6, when Mason was 4, Colin looked nothing like Mason. I kept hoping that Alice and Alan never had any reason to have a DNA test done on their kids. I don't really know the reason for it, and Mitzi never told me ahead of time, but at one point Alice asked Mitzi to post on Facebook photos of her and me when we were kids, and Mitzi complied. It was about 6 months after Mitzi posted our childhood photos on her Facebook page when she hit me with "I have good news." "What, darling?" was my smiling reply. "You remember Alice and Alan Thompson from our weekend at the lodge, who we've both been following on Facebook? They're visiting our city a week from this weekend, and I've invited them to stay with us for 2 nights. Since we've moved, we have plenty of room." Both Mitzi and I had gotten promotions, were making good money, and had recently purchased a 6-bedroom house. "Wonderful, sweetie," I replied with my heart in my throat and with a sudden stomach ache. The weekend that Alice, Alan, Colin, and Mason stayed at our house was the most stressful of my life for 3 reasons. 1, Alice was very attractive, even better than the weekend at the lodge, despite having given birth to 2 children in the meantime, with a corresponding reaction from my treacherous body. 2, I was afraid that Colin was my son, and worst of all 3, I was afraid that I would be exposed as Colin's father, not mentioned before. I'm 6 feet 5 inches tall, a foot 30 cm taller than Mitzi, but only 6 inches 15 cm taller than Alice. Alice and Alan are virtually the same height at 5 foot 11. I have blonde hair and blue eyes. Alice has light brunette hair and blue eyes. Alan has black hair and brown eyes. Colin is in the 99th percentile of height for his age 7 at the time that they visited, and has blonde hair and blue eyes. Mason has black hair and brown eyes and is of average size for his age. I thought that I pulled off being nonchalant most of the weekend, and in general it wasn't as bad as I had expected, except for one thing. I don't know how she managed it, but at one point during the weekend, Alice finagled for her and me to go to a convenience store together to get some ice and a few other items. The way there was no problem. Before we got into the car on the way back, however, Alice suddenly pulled from her purse a swab and vial of the type that you see on crime scene investigation shows on TV. "I need something from you before we return, Beck," Alice said, getting in my face with a diabolical smile on her face as she held up the swab. What's that?" I meekly and stupidly asked. "You've seen CSI on TV, Beck. You know exactly what it is. I need a DNA sample, and I'm not taking no for an answer. Did you really think that spending time with me would have no consequences?" I timidly gave her the sample. The ride back was quiet except for a statement: "If Colin turns out to be your son, I have no intention of telling anyone. I'll just need your medical records in case they would have some relevance to his health in the future. You'll provide them, won't you, Beck?" she queried with an even more diabolical grin than when she confronted me with the swab and vial. "Why do you think that I might be his father?" I disingenuously inquired. "You must be joking. Alan doesn't remember our first night together at the lodge. Every time you're around me you get instantly excited like now, and Colin looks just like you, and luckily Alan is too stupid to realize it. If you are his father, will you send me the medical records?" she growled. I realized I was embarrassed again being around her, so I sighed and meekly replied, "Okay, Alice." 2 weeks later, Alice called me at my office. After brief small talk in a song not mean voice, she said, "I'll need those medical records, Beck. Send them to me in a package marked confidential to my office address." I did as asked, wondering how fucked up my life would become if Alice ever needed to use them. At my office 2 weeks after I sent my medical records, I received a FedEx envelope marked confidential. When I opened it, there were 3 very sharp 8:1/2x11-inch color photographs. All 3 featured Alice in various candid positions. I instantly became excited. The episode of the exchange of confidential envelopes combined with my memory of Alice had two predictable effects on me. The first effect, I dream about spending time with Alice almost every day when I look at the pictures she sent. The second intended effect, I no longer scoff at stories about a guy mistakenly being with the person he thought was his wife. Subscribe to our channel so that your second C gaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.